Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of Season 1 of The Sopranos. Now, before getting around to sharing more of my thoughts on this season, I would like to give a special shout out to Shine for requesting this review of Season 1, as well as reviews of every season in this series. And if there's another TV show, film, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. The link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, The Sopranos is one of those shows that is considered by many to be one of the best, if not the best show out there. It's considered to be a television landmark. It definitely left a pretty significant impact on pop culture when it initially aired. It's understandably considered to be one of the more influential television shows, just when it comes to the way that it's written and the way that it's structured. You can look at a lot of Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or other streaming service original series or miniseries, and you can see a lot of the writing style that is absolutely influenced by The Sopranos in terms of how the episodes are structured and how things are set up, where you get hooked on the show because you want to see what happens next, because of how everything is established when it comes to the style of writing. So it's very influential in that regard. It also put HBO even further on the map when it comes to original programming and made it a powerhouse when it comes to television, to the point where HBO was considered to be the best network for many years, even over actual network television, like Fox and CBS and NBC and so on and so forth. But it's not a show that I really saw until very recently. And the reason for that is not because I wasn't interested. Like, I was definitely curious about the show, see what the hype is all about. But there were just so many other shows or so many other films that I was even more interested in and more curious about. So I put a priority on those over something like The Sopranos. And after seeing just one season, I'm hooked. And I wish I'd watched this show sooner. But, it's better late than never. And I really cannot wait to see what happens next after just seeing 13 episodes. And that's a really impressive thing, that after only one season you're hooked. That's a sign of a really good show. Now, The Sopranos, it's created by David Chase, who initially he crafted this as a feature film. It was going to be inspired loosely by mob culture and different stories in the news and the media about mobsters, and there was going to be influence creatively by other mob films that had come before it, and he was going to incorporate a lot of the same things: the therapy angle, the drama involving the mother, because a lot of it was based on his own personal experience. The whole tumultuous relationship between Tony and his mother was something that David Chase experienced himself with his own mother. And his whole experience going to therapy is also something that was incorporated into the story based on his own life experiences. But according to a colleague of his, this wasn't something that was necessarily going to do that well as a film, in large part because of the fact that it was maybe a bit too drama focused, maybe a bit too out there for the typical mob movie audience. And also the fact that the mob movie was something that was starting to fall out of favor at the time. It was not doing as well financially, and it felt like a genre that was very played out. So David's colleague suggested to take this project to television, and the rest is history. So he brought the show to Fox initially, which is interesting when you think about it, because due to The Sopranos and its success and other shows that were inspired by the success of The Sopranos, HBO became the king of network television. And a network television company almost had the opportunity to have The Sopranos, but they passed on it. And I get it though, because The Sopranos was a little bit too edgy, a little bit too violent, a little bit too risque for network television. So Fox, maybe they might have considered it to be potentially worth investing in, but a lot of changes would have had to been made, and I don't think David was okay with that, and that's perfectly understandable, and it was definitely the right call. Because can you imagine a watered down Sopranos? Like, what is even the point? I mean, it would be like the Mad TV parody when The Sopranos was on PAX. So it ultimately wound up at HBO. And HBO, I think they just paid for the pilot initially. And the pilot went over well with a lot of people in the industry. And that led to HBO deciding to pay for 12 more episodes, which led to the 13 episode first season. And just right from the very beginning, like, it was a hit. Like, the first episode, the pilot episode, drew in some pretty big ratings, and then it just continued to climb from there. And not only did it get a lot of ratings, when it comes to people watching the show on their television sets at home, but also from critics. So it was a hit with audiences and critics alike. And David Chase, he didn't direct a lot of episodes. In fact, I think he only directed one episode in this season. And I think he only wrote, my bad. He only wrote a couple episodes. Like, he co-wrote another one. Actually, no, he wrote like a few of them. But he didn't write the majority of the episodes of season 1. But he was the showrunner, and he was responsible for creating the framework for the show and for the season. He was very hands-on, and according to a lot of people, pretty demanding, because he wanted things done his way. So even though he's not listed as a writer on every episode, I'm pretty sure he was still very heavily involved creatively. And you know that you have a really special show when even the intro is incredible. I love the intro to this show. It's one of my favorite intros when it comes to any television show. Like, I don't even want to skip the intro because I love this intro so much. I love the way that it's shot with this POV and perspective. Tony Soprano looking outside his window while he's on his way home from a job, and just see all the different sights and sounds in the neighborhood, and just the way that it's cut and it's edited together. And I love the song choice. The theme for the show, Woke Up This Morning, the Chosen One mix by Alabama 3. It's a very catchy song, and it fits the tone of the show really well, and I love it. Like, it just, every time I see this intro, I'm like, all right, I'm in for some good shit. I'm in for some good stuff right here, because even the intro is great. And speaking of great, this cast is not only great, it's beyond great. Like, this is a phenomenal, fantastic, stellar cast. And of course, it starts with the headliner, which is James Gandolfini. And Gandolfini plays Tony Soprano, and it's honestly one of the finest performances, not only of Gandolfini's career, but in any television show when it comes to a leading man. It's that good and that magnificent. And it's in large part due to True Romance. He had a bit part in that film, and Chase and the producers, they saw it. They thought he was really good in it, and they felt that he would be a good fit for Tony Soprano based on what he did in that film. And speaking of Soprano, and speaking of Tony, uh, the original plan might have been a little bit different. Stephen Van Zandt, who wound up having a role in the show as Silvio, he auditioned to play Tony Soprano. And Chase and some of the other people who were working on the show, they felt he didn't do that bad of a job in the audition, but they wanted to go with a more experienced actor, which made perfect sense. And they didn't necessarily have a role for him at the time, but then they ultimately created one for him, which ultimately became the role of Silvio. But yeah, I can't sing enough praises for Gandolfini's performance in this. He's not only charismatic and charming in the same vein as like Joe Pesci or De Niro or Pacino when it comes to their roles in these other gangster films, but he's also intimidating when he needs to be. And he provides a certain nuance and amount of layers to the performance that is honestly astounding. So he's not only a guy who could charm your pants off, but he's also a guy who you don't want to be on his bad side. But he's also a guy who's willing to openly express his emotions and does it in a very believable and authentic way. The scenes throughout the season where Tony is dealing with all kinds of different emotions, anger, grief, depression, is some really strong acting. And it's in a lot of ways one of the things that really holds the show together is Gandolfini's performance when it comes to each and every episode. All the different things that Tony Soprano is struggling with or dealing with that week, and how it affects him and everyone around him. And Gandolfini just masterfully handles everything about this character in a way that it is astounding. It genuinely is a really terrific performance. And the rest of the cast is also really great. I mean, Lorraine Bracco is Jennifer. Melfi, Tony's therapist, is one of her best performances of her career. This was her going outside her comfort zone and playing a role that she's not accustomed to and nailing it. And it's a testament to Chase's vision that she was given the opportunity to do that. Because initially, Chase and the other people involved with the show, they were looking at Bracco to play Carmela, Tony's wife, understandably, because she did such a good job in Goodfellas. But she didn't want to be typecast and didn't want to do the same role that she already did in Goodfellas. So she was the one that championed and campaigned to play Jennifer, and Chase and the rest of the producers, they decided, yeah, sure. And she absolutely killed that role. And Edie Falco is fantastic as Carmela, Tony's wife, who's at this point, she's starting to really feel some guilt and starting to feel the stress of being the wife of a capo, and it's really starting to eat away at her, but she still loves him and she loves her family and she doesn't want things to fall apart. And her performance in every episode is really good, but her performance in college was something else, and she earned that Emmy and then some for her performance in that episode. And Eddie Falco, before this show, like a lot of other people in this show, they weren't really household names. They weren't really super well known actors. They had worked, but not in a lot of big projects or a lot of big films. So this is an opportunity for her to really leave her mark, and she absolutely did that. And just in one season, she did that. Just a really a talented actress, and uh, cannot think of anyone else to play Carmela, or anyone, any other actor like in this cast. Like I can't even think of another person who could play these roles. They're so well suited for these characters. Michael Imperioli as Christopher Moltisanti, Tony's ambitious cousin who is trying to rise up in the ranks. Just a perfect amount of brashness and bravado that really fits the character very well. And immaturity. Dominic Chianese is Junior Soprano, Tony's uncle, who ultimately at one point later on in the season actually becomes the boss. Just another really solid performer. Vincent Pastore as Big Pussy, Stephen Van Zandt as Silvio, and Tony Sirico as Polly Walnuts. Anthony Soldiers. The three of them are great. They all have really good chemistry with one another. They all do a good job playing their respective roles. Are they the best actors in the world? No, especially Van Sant. But they make it work with personality. And that's what makes these characters so endearing and fan favorites, despite the fact that, maybe the performances aren't the best in the world. But there's still a certain authenticity to it, and they're having fun with their performances, which really goes a long way. Robert Iler and Jamie-Lynn Sigler as AJ and Meadow Soprano, two performances that are not eye-popping, but still efficient enough. Nancy Marchand as Olivia Soprano, who is arguably really the antagonist of the show, is absolutely brilliant in her role. Initially, I thought this role was tiresome and tedious because it's just one note. She's just an angry, bitter old woman who is manipulative and so on and so forth, and just has this approach of just kind of playing the character in the same way each and every episode. But as the season goes on, as you see more and more of this character, and you see more and more of the machinations behind her psyche and her plan and what's going on with her, then the performance really starts to stand out in a good way, especially when it comes to her performance in the finale, when she's being wheeled away on the gurney, and Anthony is telling her that he knows that she was in on the hit on his life, and he's talking about how, I'm gonna take you out. Like I'm not gonna hold back. I know what you were trying to do, and I know what you're all about. And she's smiling. That's a great bit of acting where it's just no lines of dialogue, no anything. She's supposedly so ill, and she had a stroke, and she's being taken away, and she's not doing well, and she's having cognizant issues with her mental state, but it's all an act because she's a total narcissist and she has BPD, and it's honestly a really good performance once you realize what is behind it. Because initially it was like, this fucking bitch, like, but that's the point. You're not supposed to like her. She's inherently an unlikable person, and there's reasons behind that, and just there's different little nuances and layers that the actress brings to it that just makes it just really good stuff. And the rest of the supporting cast is great too. I mean, Al Sapienza as Mikey, Joe Bottaluccio Jr. as Jimmy, Drea De Matteo as Adriana, Jerry Adler as Hesh. Um, Anthony DeSando as Brendan Filoni. John Hurd from Home Alone, who played Kevin's dad. He was in other films. Who plays a corrupt police detective who works for Tony Soprano. You have Catherine Narducci, who plays Charmaine, and John Ventimiglia, who plays Artie. And, other actors like Michael Rispoli, who plays Jackie, who's the original boss of the DeMeo family, who then gets sick, and then ultimately it leads to a transition of power in the family. But yeah, it's a really, really good cast. And there are only 13 episodes in season 1. And for the most part, most of them are like 48 minutes to like 49 minutes long. Some are a little bit longer than that. But the longest an episode is maybe an hour. So the first episode, the pilot, is called The Sopranos. It was directed by David Chase, and it was written by David Chase. And I think it's a really solid pilot episode. It does a great job establishing not only the setting, but also the characters and different plot points that would be carried on throughout the season. I think it's a really great example of how to do a pilot the right way when it comes to establishing your cast of characters and also bringing up future plot points that will be mentioned or will be dealt with later on in the season. And there's a lot of other unique things about it that I really like. I love the metaphor of the ducks and how they represent Tony's fear of losing his family. I love how it starts things out showing Tony in a very vulnerable state with his panic attacks. It's not something that you normally see in these kind of stories with these larger than life mob personalities and these mob mafiosos or these capos. Like you don't really see a lot of that. So what you see is a more realistic, down to earth, gritty portrayal of these people. It shows them as real people, not as these larger than life, almost comic book sort of archetypes. So it's nice to see something different in that regard where he has issues with his mental health and they are actually affecting his physical health. And that's why he decides to actually go to therapy. And then the therapy actually helps him. And but because he's in the mob, there's a certain stigma associated with going to therapy. So that's something that Tony has to struggle with and deal with throughout the season, as well as all of his other issues. It's therapy is helping, and so are all the medicine that he's taking. He's no longer having as many panic attacks, but it's causing other issues that he has to deal with. And it's this damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of scenario for Tony. And there's a lot of other stuff like involving Christopher and him trying to get approval and applause and respect from Tony. He even kills one guy, a rival mobster, and he does a job, and Tony's not really reciprocating the respect. Like he's not letting him know personally that he did a good job, and that eats away at him. And so that leads us to a confrontation at the end, but eventually they work things out. You have the whole stuff involving Artie and his restaurant and how Junior wants to kill some guy who's a rival of his, who is a frequenter. He frequents the restaurant as a diner, and Tony doesn't want that to go down because that'll be bad for Artie and really be bad for his restaurant. And so he's trying to find a way to get Artie to go away, so then the shooting could go down, and then Artie's not going to be there, and they can work things out later. But it doesn't work out that way. So then Tony has to make a tough decision, and he decides to blow up the restaurant. And that sets up a future dramatic event later on in the season between Artie and Tony. And you have the whole stuff involving Junior and Livia and her frustration with Tony because Tony wants to put her in a home because she's clearly showing signs that she should be in a home, but she's stubborn and doesn't want to listen to him. And so, of course, that leads to him, wanting to go to therapy more. And there's just a lot of stuff involving this pilot that is just really good. And even moments that are just really funny, like great bits of dark comedy. Like the whole bit where Tony and Christopher chase after this guy who works at this HMO company, and they chase after him in broad daylight and kick the shit out of him. And then Tony says something along the lines like, HMO, like, what are you crying for? You're fucking covered. Like, just stuff like that is really one of the things that makes this show so endearing for a lot of people, despite its subject matter, is because it does have moments that are genuinely funny and have some good levity to break up the drama a little bit. And yeah, really, really strong pilot episode, really well directed by David Chase, really good writing. Episode 2 is called 46 Long. This one is directed by Dan Attias and written by David Chase. And I'm not going to say a ton about the direction for these episodes because for the most part, other than maybe 1 or 2 episodes, they all are pretty much the same in terms of the style, in terms of the visual flair. It's almost like David Chase or somebody behind the scenes was like, hey, okay, this is what I want for the vision of this show. I don't want you to stray away too much from it. I want you to focus on this kind of style of filmmaking and this movement of the camera and all of this. I don't want you to go too outside the box. And I think that honestly is a good idea to have a consistent visual style for the most part throughout the season. And it continues with this episode, 46 Long. This is another episode that is more of a day in the life of the Sopranos. And there are some things that are established that could be carried on or worked out later on in the season. But there's a lot of it is just more like the day in the life type stuff. So just more day-to-day experiences with the Sopranos family, more therapy sessions between Tony and his therapist, some stuff involving Tony's son and his teacher whose car was stolen. So then Tony decides to send some soldiers of his to go find who stole the car. One of the people I think that was involved with the car theft is Mike Epps of all people, which I did not expect at all. So that was kind of surprising. And they can't find the car, so then they ultimately force these people to steal a better model of the same car, and then they give it a new paint job to give it to the teacher. You have this stuff involving Livia, where she winds up having to go to the nursing home because now she's really showing that she shouldn't be out in public too much and driving around or sustaining herself or living in her own home because she's a danger to other people because she ran over this neighbor of hers. And knowing Livia, I don't know if it was an accident, but you know, that causes her to be put in a home. And of course, this causes Tony to feel guilty because his mom is giving a guilt trip for putting her in there, and abandoning her. And of course, that leads to more therapy sessions and another panic attack, but he's still doing better than he was previously. So it's things are getting progressively better for him despite the continual stress. And the therapist is trying to get him to find different ways to displace his anger about his mother. He's not going to hear it because he's still at the point where he's in denial when it comes to his mother and her real self, the reality of his mother, and how manipulative she is and how she actually doesn't really care about him and doesn't care really about anyone and is just a complete and total narcissist and a sociopath. But he doesn't necessarily see that yet, and he's not willing to see that because it's his mom. It's understandable. And then you have this whole scene, which is, when you think about it in the wrong context, like in a different context, it's not funny. It's just a moment where he beats the crap out of this guy who works at the Bada Bing, the strip club that Tony owns. But when you see the scene, it's pretty hilarious because the guy literally does not know how to use the phone. He's a total just moron. And that's a moment where Tony's anger just boils over. He just beats the crap out of him with the phone. And just the way that it's set up, it's honestly funny. And there's other funny stuff too. I don't know if this was the episode that this line was in, but it might have been a later episode. It might have even been the pilot episode. But there's a whole moment with Mikey where Tony walks up to him, and when Mikey's in the car, and you know they have this conversation and whatever, and Tony has this line which I just find to be absolutely hilarious, where it's like, "Oh, you are they gonna run a telethon for fuckface-itis?" Yeah, because the guy's just being a total fuckface. Like I love that line. And yeah, it's a good episode. I like 46 long. And of course, you know, there's this whole drama involving Brendan and Junior, because Brendan and his and Chris, they initially try to steal this truck, but it's a truck that is essentially tied to Junior because this company pays protection money to Junior, so it causes a lot of problems. Chris decides to just butt out of it and stop trying to steal these trucks. Well, Brendan decides to go out on his own and steal a truck full of suits, and it causes a lot of strife. And Tony doesn't want to deal with it, so he just allows Chris and Brendan to just basically deal with it on their own. And so that leads to some issues down the road. Episode 3 is called Denial, Anger, and Acceptance. This one is directed by Nick Gomez with a script by Mark Saraceni. But I'm pretty sure David Chase was still very heavily involved with the script, even though his name is not on the credits. This one deals with Chris and Brendan. You know, they eventually do the right thing. They return the stolen truck. Tony, he gets credit for, you know, trying to figure things out and smooth things over, which helps when it comes to his whole antagonistic relationship with his uncle Junior. This causes Junior, though, to try to go to Livia to try to pick her brain a little bit more. You have this whole reoccurring, well, not reoccurring, but this whole occurring subplot throughout this episode involving this Jewish guy who's being extorted by his son-in-law. So then he hires Tony and his goons to try to, you know, smooth things over. And then eventually he feels bad and calls him a golem because he realizes what he's doing and how he's doing it, and doesn't support that. You have Jackie, the boss, who's got cancer, and you got the whole stress that's coming from that's really getting to Tony and eating away at him. So he goes to therapy to discuss his feelings about that, and his feelings about being called a Frankenstein monster or a golem. And he then goes to his daughter's choir recital. He gets moved to tears by her solo, but he's completely unaware that she spent all this time using speed sold to her by Chris to do her schoolwork. And so there's a lot of different sort of things that are going on when it comes to the drama. And yeah, I will admit, there's a lot of soap opera elements in the writing, but it works. Episode 4 is called Meadowlands. This one's directed by John Patterson with a script by Jason Cahill. This is where tensions start to really continue to boil. Tony winds up taking out Palmisi for Brendan's murder, because Brendan, at the end of the previous episode, he gets shot. And Tony then uses the advice of from his therapist after the death of Jackie to deal with elders. And so that's where he comes up with this plan to allow Junior to become the new boss. But in reality, he's the one that's really pulling the strings. So he manipulates things where he's the one that's actually the boss and really doing a lot of the main decisions, but Junior gets the title, and in the process, if anything goes down, then he can take the hits, which is really shrewd and very clever. And this is also where he's dealing with some issues involving his attraction to his therapist, and that's causing some problems with him at home with his wife. And then this is also where I believe Vin is first introduced, John Hurd's character, and he asks him to tail his therapist, but he's a total drunk and an asshole, so completely takes things way too far and beats up Melfi's date. AJ almost gets into a fight with a classmate of his, but then the boy winds up doing the right thing, not necessarily because of the fact that he just wants to smooth things over with his best friend, or at least a former friend, because the two used to be friends, but now they're butting heads. But he does it because he realizes who AJ's dad is and doesn't want to be on the bad side of Tony Soprano. And so he gives AJ the money that he owes him for tearing up his shirt. And this causes AJ to be understandably confused, and then he goes to Meadow for advice, and then his sister tells him about the reality, the truth about who his father is. And so now there's that going on, and now there's that tension that's boiling under the surface when it comes to Tony's kids and them realizing who Tony is and what he does. Episode 5 is called College. This one's directed by Alan Coulter, written by James Manos Jr. and David Chase. This is, I would probably say, the best episode of the season, or definitely one of the best episodes. It's definitely one of the more critically acclaimed episodes, and for good reason. It has a very innocuous initial start where Tony is taking Meadow to tour colleges, but there's this insidious nature to it, where you're not only dealing with Tony realizing that his daughter, she's getting older, she's getting to the point where she might be going away to college and might be leaving the nest and being gone for good, and she's growing up, and so he's got to deal with that, and also deal with the a little bit of the pain that he might have felt that he didn't actually follow through and finish college when he had that opportunity. But really the main insidiousness is that there is this former member of his mob who became a rat, who he recognizes, who is kind of following them around. And so now the episode is not only just this whole thing where Tony is taking his daughter to these colleges, but it's also Tony trying to stay one step ahead of this guy who's trying to kill him. And so Tony has to, for one, make sure that it's actually the guy that he thinks he is. So there's a lot of tension involving that, because he's got to make all these phone calls and do all these things to try to figure out who this guy is, and you got to do an investigation on his own, and scope out the guy's travel agency and figure out the clues. And by the time he does figure out that it's who the guy really is, who he says he is, there's almost a moment where he gets shot at the motel, but the guy doesn't decide to go through with it because his daughter's there. Had the whole stuff with his daughter and her just essentially wanting her father to tell her the truth, because she knows now. She knows what her father does, and she just wants her father to tell her and be honest about it. And Tony eventually is. And so there's a nice moment of bonding there between Meadow and Tony. But there's a lot of stuff going on with the guy who's trying to kill Tony, and then Tony has to find a way to take the guy out before he takes him out, and maybe even his daughter. And so you have the whole stuff going on with Carmela, who's really struggling with the realization that the therapist is a woman, despite the fact that Tony had told her otherwise. So she's upset about that, thinks that Tony's cheating on her. So then she confides in this priest named Phil who comes over, and while they're watching The Remains of the Day on DVD, uh, they have this moment where something almost happens between the two. They almost kiss, but Phil has a serious issue with his faith and goes to the restroom and then like pukes. And so there's this whole sort of stuff involving Carmela and her almost cheating on her husband because she feels that her husband is cheating on her. And it's some really good writing because there's all this stuff that's going on all at once at the same time. And it ultimately culminates in Carmel and Tony eventually arguing about Phil and Melfi when he comes back. And that's after he's already killed this guy. He strangled this rat. And so he strangled this guy. He already killed this guy. He's already dealing with that over his head. And now he's getting into a fight with his wife. And it's just one of those things where Tony's just really in between a rock and a hard place by the end of this episode. But it's a great episode. Episode 6 is called Pax Soprana. This one is directed by Alan Taylor, written by Frank Renzulli. This is where Tony is starting to have some issues with his sex drive because of the Prozac, and he finds himself even more attracted to Melfi to the point where he's like having dreams about her. He then tries to really express these feelings towards her, but that doesn't go well. He tries to make up for it by having her car stolen and repaired. I don't know why I said repelled. I don't even know if that's even a word. But he tries to, put the moves on her. She isn't having any of it. He even tries to cheer her up by having her car repaired, but she still isn't really that receptive to that. He then is trying to still patch things up with his wife. He has these feelings for Melfi, but then he's still trying to tell Carmela to her face that he has no attraction to her. So eventually they do reconcile. Junior's grandson dies of a drug overdose. Junior then has the dealer hunted down and killed. This then pisses off a DiMeo Capo, as the dealer was his top earner. So now that's causing issues. And the DiMeo Capo is starting to question the new boss, Junior. Junior's taxing Tony's associate Hesh because Olivia and her advice, but that doesn't go well. So then Tony has to negotiate with Junior and Hesh to try to lower the payment down. And then by the end of the episode, everyone is photographed by a guy who's in the FBI, who's masquerading as a waiter, and he's taking all the photos of everybody. And that's where the FBI realizes who the new boss is, and it's Junior. And episode 7 is called Down Neck. This one's directed by Lorraine Senna. This features a script by Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess. This is, I would say, the weakest episode of season 1. It's also the most tonally inconsistent and also the most visually inconsistent episode. But even with it being the weakest, it's still not bad. it's still okay. There are still some interesting things about this episode. This one starts with AJ getting in trouble for stealing the communal wine from the church and getting drunk at school. And then there's this whole speculation about him maybe having ADD. This causes Tony to be stressed out about his genes potentially corrupting his son. And that leads to him telling a story to his therapist about his childhood. So you get some flashbacks to Tony when he was a kid. And you get a little sense of what his home life was. And so I'm like, oh, I'm all right with that. You also realize that he had some sisters who are no longer part of his or his mother's life because of just how difficult their childhood was. And he talks about, the stuff with his father taking his sister Janice to a bunch of different places, and he felt bad and jealous. So then he decided to figure out what was going on and hide in his father's car while they were going to a fair. But then he finds out, well, the only reason why his father was taking his sister was to create a cover while he did business. And this is when Tony realizes the truth about what his father does. But while he has these flashbacks or while he's reminiscing, that enables him to realize the positives when it comes to how AJ feels about him. And so that makes it so he's able to deal with the fact that AJ, he might not be the best kid. He might have some issues, but he sees how AJ looks up to him, just like if he looked up to his father. So that makes him feel a definite sense of pride. This is also when AJ tells Livia that her son is seeing a therapist because AJ is going to see his grandmother more often because it's one of the mandates that his mom provided after he got in trouble at school. Like a lot of this episode, it just seems very fillerish. A lot of it is just the throwback stuff to Tony Soprano when he was a kid. You get to see young Uncle Junior, and you get to see young Livia, and Tony when he was a boy, and all of that sort of stuff. But the reason why I'm not really super big fan of it is not just because of the fact that it just feels like a filler episode. It's the way that it's edited. I don't like the quick cut editing. I don't like the way that it's structured. It's very jarring, and I'm not really a big fan of it. But episode 8, though, The Legend of Tennessee Multisanti, I really like that episode. So there's a bit of a lull, but then it goes right back up in terms of quality with this one. This was directed by Tim Van Patten with a script by Frank Renzulli and David Chase. This episode, a lot of it is more of a focus on Christopher, and this leads to some really good acting by the actor Imperioli, who's playing this character. And he's writing a script about a mafia kid, like a younger member of the mafia who's trying to rise up the rankings. It's called Made Man, and he's trying to do it in a way where he's not implicating anybody, but he's struggling with writer's block. And so he's struggling with writer's block when it comes to his script, and this is all around the time when the FBI is starting to do raids. They're getting indicted, so there's all this sort of extra drama and stress that's going on between everybody in Sopranos' crew. This is also where Melfi and her ex have this conversation over dinner about whether or not she should continue to treat Tony because he feels that could be dangerous. She uh, uh, is steadfast. She's not going to give up on Tony. She's going to keep seeing him, even though she does see the red flags. Livia tells Junior that Tony is in therapy. This causes some further issues to bubble up between Junior and Tony. The DeMeo family, that there's this whole thing going on with the FBI and the raid, and so the capos, they hide all this evidence to try to destroy the evidence before the FBI can see it. Chris has these nightmares about this man that he killed earlier on in the season. And like the opening of this episode in particular is so atmospheric and moody with the lighting and everything, and it's a nightmare scene, and I love it. It's like one of my favorite scenes in the first season. It's just the opening nightmare sequence that Chris has. And so he digs up the body of this guy and then decides to relocate it because it just these dreams make it seem like there's something wrong, and he has to fix it because it could screw him over. He struggles to write this mob screenplay at the same time, still feeling anger about not being recognized as a feared figure of the DeMeo family, and so that leads to an altercation at the bakery where he shoots this poor guy in the foot. But then he learns that his name is in the newspaper, which makes him feel better. Which, it's very narcissistic, but this is mob storyline. This is a mob show we're talking about, so that's just comes with the territory. But yeah, I really like this episode. I really like the structure of it, and it's nice to see Christopher have a little bit more of a focus. Episode 9 is called Boca. This one is directed by Andy Wolk. This one features a script by Jason Cahill, Robin Green, and Mitchell Burgess. And this is where the indictments really start to be getting thrown down. The indictments are happening. The FBI is investigating the DeMeo family. And a lot of the people are starting to go on the run. Junior he goes on the run to Boca. And this is where you see his girlfriend, and you realize how thin-skinned Junior is, because he goes down on her from time to time, and then she tells somebody that she's an acquaintance with this. It then spreads to Carmela, who tells Tony about it. And so when Tony tells Junior about his cunnilingus, it causes Junior to be furious and frustrated, and that's what ultimately leads to him to pretty much not considering him setting up plans to take out Tony, just because he tends to go down on a woman every now and then. Like, how thin-skinned are you? Like, where he's old school, so that's part of it. It's like a thing that, it's a problem with your masculinity or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, when Tony's ribbing him about it, he should have been like, when Tony was like, you got a taste for sushi, he should have been like, yeah, I do. It tastes delicious. You got a problem with it? Like, do you want to go to war over this? So, like, what I do with my women, like, it's like, it's one of those things where it just exposes like how thin-skinned some of these, like, these tough guys. These guys are tough. They're tough guys. They're mobsters, but like they can't embrace just going down on a woman from time to time. It's a crisis. It's an affront to their masculinity if other people find out about it, especially other men in the mob. He breaks up with his girlfriend, Junior, as a result, pulls his money out of her business, shoves a pie in her face, tells other people that Tony is seeing a therapist. So tells this other guy, Paul Misi, that he's seeing a therapist, who then is trying to insinuate that he's being an informant. So that's the other reason why Tony is now considered to be expendable. Meadows' soccer coach, he's trying to leave town to Rhode Island for a better job, but the wise guys, in the area, they don't want him to leave because they're having some success with this guy, and they think that their daughters like this guy, but it's actually the opposite. They don't like this guy at all. And then you find out the guy's a total scumbag because the team star player who's a friend with Meadow, she reveals that the coach sexually assaulted her. So then you have this whole extra drama about Tony trying to kill this guy, but then Artie comes in and then gets him to change his mind, even when Artie himself wanted to take the guy out. And Tony then eventually calls off the hit. The coach gets arrested. The fact that this script was willing to go there in terms of a coach sexually assaulting a minor, a player on his team, was pretty ballsy, and I appreciate that. Like, that's not something I expected, and the whole drama that ensued with that, and Tony deciding to do the right thing, like, that was a nice moment of character growth for Tony Soprano. Uh, it's like he grows as a character while Junior just goes completely backwards. And then, he's starting to set things up to maybe take out Tony. Episode 10 is called A Hit is a Hit. It's directed by Matthew Penn with a script by Joe Basso and Frank Renzulli. This one is more focused on how the mob used to be involved in the music industry, which I really wasn't aware of, so that was interesting. And how Hesh at one point, he represented and was helping write these different songs for these African American singers. And so it deals with white guilt, and it's all brought up by this African American rapper who's played by Bokeem Woodbine, who brings up this dispute with Hesh about royalties. And this rapper also catches the eye of Adriana, Chris's girlfriend, and Chris, he doesn't really necessarily think that this is the best idea, but he goes along with this idea because Adriana is very passionate about it. She has this band that she thinks could be a success, and she only knows about it because one of her exes is a lead singer, and she ultimately presents this band to the rapper, who then decides to fund an album for this band and provide a contract possibly. And this is causing issues between Chris and Adriana because Chris, he doesn't really have as much faith in the band as she does, but he's just going along with it to please her. But then once he hears the music and he thinks that it sucks, and he shows it to Hesh, and he also thinks that it sucks, that causes a wedge between him and his girlfriend. Then you have this whole stuff involving the rapper and Hesh, and where Hesh doesn't agree to pay him the royalties because he thinks that he's just trying to, manipulate him and screw him over. So then there's this whole string of lawsuits that is then being introduced into the fray. And then you have this other stuff involving Tony and his neighbor, Cusimano, and Tony talking to his therapist and talking about how, well, this is how he goes to his therapist after this, but this is where he feels like he wants to branch out a little bit more. Spend some time with different people, outside of his community, outside of his mob group, and spend some time with the regular people, with the other people who were outside of the mob. And he actually does go golfing with his neighbor and his friends, and he gets paraded around like a clown, and they keep asking him all these mob questions, and he feels ashamed and just feels embarrassed. And then he goes to his therapist and talks about it. And so he stops doing that because, and then he talks about like his childhood, where he used to mock this kid with a cleft palate. And then he never really understood that kid's pain until he experienced it himself when he spent some time with Cusimano and his friends. And so more depth is added to Tony as a character. And then, Tony pranks Cusimano by filling a box with sand and then leaves it with them. Doesn't tell him exactly what it is, but, he leaves it with him so he could continue to mess with him. So yeah, another good episode. I like the music angle. That was something different. Episode 11 is called Nobody Knows Anything. This one's directed by Henry J. Braunstein, written by Frank Renzulli. In this one, you have the FBI. They are really now coming down hard on the DeMaio family. They arrest Jimmy. Pussy gets caught, but he gets mysteriously released. So then there's questions about Pussy being an informant because Mazakian, the corrupt cop, he informs Tony that he heard that Pussy was wearing a wire. So now this causes issues with Tony because he's very close friends with Paulie. He's very close friends with Paulie and Pussy. But it causes him issues because of Pussy in particular, because now he's questioning Pussy's allegiance. He's questioning Pussy's ties to his group and to the mob in general, and questioning whether or not he's a traitor. So he's got to deal with all of that. But he still doesn't believe it because he needs to know for sure. So he's trying to get Paulie to take Pussy to a bathhouse to get him to reveal the wire. But Pussy refuses to take his clothes off, saying that it's high blood pressure and orders from the doctor. So it's still up in the air. And then he disappears. Mazakian kills himself because he got caught in a brothel. And then there's all this other stuff that's happening. Altieri is released, talks to Tony, who Tony then, due to his behavior, realizes that he's the informant. So, of course, then he sends out a hit on him. Junior learns from Livia that the mothers of several of his capos have been placed in a nursing home. And then this is where he realizes that they're meeting behind his back. So then he really organizes a hit for real. Like, he was thinking about organizing a hit on Tony earlier, with the whole cunnilingus thing and going to therapy and potentially being an informant, but he was willing to kind of put it aside. But now it's one step too far, so he's got to take him out. Episode 12 is called Isabella. This is directed by Alan Coulter with a script by Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess. And this is where Tony is just completely wallowing in depression, because this is after Pussy has disappeared and hasn't come back for quite a long time. And he's not only on Prozac now, but he's on lithium, which is causing him to have hallucinations about this young Italian exchange student who's watching over the Cusimano's house, who isn't real. She's completely fabricated and just she's a fabrication of his imagination. But it's still something that connects with what's going on in his head at the time. Because Melfi mentions that, yeah, she's not real, but she represents some real things in terms of him wanting to have a kind and caring and loving mother figure in his life instead of what he actually has in his life, which is the complete opposite. And the way that this episode in particular writes depression is so damn good because it's so realistic. Like the whole stuff with Tony not wanting to get up and staying in bed all day and not being motivated to do anything and not really keeping up on his personal appearance and not taking a bath and doing all this other stuff and not really feeling great and just unmotivated, no drive, no anything, doesn't want to do a dang thing. Like, that is so damn relatable as somebody who's dealt with depression. As somebody who, I gotta be honest, is currently kind of dealing with that. So to see a very realistic take on that was refreshing. There's some great acting by Gandolfini as well. And so this is also where the hit is going down. And Junior has set up something involving some guys that Mikey has hired to take out Tony, but then it just doesn't go as they initially planned. It doesn't go smoothly at all. The first time fails because Chris unwittingly saves Tony's life when he follows to check on him because he sees that he's depressed. Then The hitmen try to strike again, but Tony survives because one accidentally kills the other because they're a bunch of incompetent jerk offs. And now Tony is, hospitalized briefly. He messed up his knee a little bit in the accident. And, he's got a wounded, like an injured ear, but, he's fine. But this causes Livia to have an excuse for her to point the attention towards her, where she's like, "Oh, I don't remember who my daughter is." So that sets up the seeds that are gonna be planted throughout not only the rest of this season, but apparently like later on in other seasons involving Livia and her BPD and everything. Yeah, another really good episode. And just one of the most realistic portrayals of depression you'll ever see in anything. And then episode 13, the finale, is called I Dream of Jeannie Cusimano. And this one's directed by John Patterson, based on a script by David Chase. And this is where things really get difficult between Tony and his therapist, because Melfi suggests that Olivia might have BPD. Tony, because it's hitting too close to home, he gets really frustrated and angry with her, breaks a glass table, and like gets in her face. But then eventually, he feels bad for that, and he sees her again later on in the episode and tells her to leave, because things are going to get really, really dangerous, and he doesn't want her to get hurt. And so she eventually does. She eventually does a go into hiding because of Junior's attempted hit and what he's going to do in retaliation. He tells his men that he's seeing the therapist, but they accept it. Some of them begrudgingly, but Paulie even admits that he saw a therapist at one time in his life. And then he just starts taking out the trash. Takes out Altieri and Palmisi. They get executed. He kills the man he suspects Junior will send after him. Next, he also takes that. He is also going to take out Junior, but the FBI then arrests Junior using information from Altieri. And by the way, Tony also gets information from the FBI about Junior. That's how he knows that Junior is the one behind the hit, because of the audio that they recorded from the nursing home. And that's a nice touch that the FBI actually gives the mob guy, actually gives him vital information. And before he's able to take out Junior, Junior gets arrested along with his other confidants and his other employees. Carmela realizes that the priest is just trying to use her and other women. So she eventually calls him out on this when he tries to visit with her later for seducing spiritually thirsty women in a really effective bit. A great moment for Carmela as well. Where Olivia tells Artie that Tony was the one that burned down the restaurant. So then Artie decides to retaliate and holds Tony at gunpoint and almost kills him. But Tony manages to convince him that he didn't do it, even though he definitely did. Livia then has a stroke. And I say stroke in air quotes because you can't trust her. And that's where you have that great scene where Tony is talking to her on the gurney and the stretcher, and is telling her, I know what you did, I know what you were part of, like I'm you're next. And she's smiling, and he's all like, she's smiling, that fucking bitch, she's smiling. And then of course everyone's all like, get out of the way, she's not doing anything, she just had a stroke. It's like, she's smiling. And then conveniently, maybe not conveniently, conveniently isn't the right word, but fittingly, the end of the episode and the end of the season is a storm, which fits because the storm has come already. Like, this is a storm. This is a major storm that's really causing a lot of things to go down, things to fall apart, things to really come into full circle and to the forefront. And the storm knocks out the power at the Sopranos house, and then they wind up spending the night and having a dinner as a family at the restaurant owned by Artie. So they go to Artie's restaurant, and then Tony has this great line of dialogue that ends the episode where it's like, we need to remember the moments that were good. Like, this is the time to remember the moments that were good amidst the storm that is the Sopranos' life. So, yeah, that's season 1 of the Sopranos. Really strong, really special, really spectacular stuff. Highly recommend it if you, for whatever reason like me, haven't seen it yet. And if you have and it's been a while, give it another watch. Like, it's still really compelling, really great stuff. Yeah. Stay tuned for my thoughts on the other seasons and more of the show in the near future. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. See ya.